Welcome to Franklin Covey's C-Suite Conversation. My name is Patrick Ledden, and each week I have the honor of sitting down and talking to an executive leader. I learn about their life, their work, the struggles they've overcome, the successes they've achieved, all with one thought in mind, to help you, our listener, on your career journey. Today, I'm joined by Amanda Davies. She's the Chief Research and Development, Sustainability, and Procurement Officer at Mars Snacking. There's no doubt you know Mars. At least you know their products. M&M's, Snickers, Kind, Dove, Skittles, Extra, Orbit. These are products we're all very much familiar with. In our conversation today, we'll talk about Amanda's career, how she got into working in the world of science and developing new products. We'll talk about how she works with farmers to understand how they run their businesses, and she really becomes a hands-on leader who goes to where the learning can best be learned, at the front line. Trust me, you're going to want to grab something to write with, sit back and take some notes as Amanda and I talk about what's going on in her world as a C-suite officer. Hey, Amanda, welcome to C-Suite Conversations.
Hey there, nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. It's exciting to get a chance to talk today. I told the listeners on the front end a bit about your current role, kind of the job description and the responsibilities you have right now, but I didn't tell them that much around your backstory. So maybe it might make good sense to start there. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so thank you. So yeah, my current role is have the privilege and the pleasure of looking after procurement, sustainability, and R&D. But that journey to this role has been a kind of 28-year career adventure within Mars, starting my very first role, which was in packaging, through some engineering roles, R&D, HR, and then in the latter part of my career, procurement, sustainability, and then the triple hat that I wear today.
Yeah, I want to talk about that triple hat, as well as the other roles you went through along your way. I think it'll be really informative to people on their own journeys. But I really want to start, if you don't mind, let's go back to when you were a little girl, because I was reading an article that talked about when you were, I think, about 11 years old, and you had an experience that made you decide that, hey, this science thing is actually pretty cool. Would you take us back to that little girl a few years ago?
I will indeed. Yeah, it was in a physics laboratory in a school in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, and the physics teacher asked us to kind of come out and put our hands on a Van der Waals generator, and we got to do that, and our hair all stood up on end. Hang on. And literally, in terms of an 11-year-old, my hair stood on end, but I was kind of like, wow, looking at my other kind of friends in the class, like, what's happening here? This is really curious, and that's probably the spark from that generator that made me realize that I had a real curiosity in science, which is absolutely being one of the sparks that's allowed me to go on the career adventure to where I am today.
Well, it sounds like that sparked quite a career adventure, as you say. I remember reading in the article too, it talked about, it wasn't like you were immediately quickly embraced necessarily by those folks who historically had worked kind of in that field. And you said you were at a career fair and you walked up and they're kind of like, yeah, the nurses are over there. So it's probably fair to say over the last couple of decades of your career that you've been a pioneer in some ways, kind of stepping into some spaces, maybe with not a lot of people in the room who've had a similar experience as you, or maybe they're not a woman as you are. I'd just be curious, like what's been that experience to kind of be one of the people kind of leading out on something?
Yeah, I think, and I can reflect back on a number of moments in my career that I could probably talk about at the time, in terms of, as I look back, you kind of you could talk about being a pioneer. Probably at the moment they happened, be it, remember sometimes at school, kind of, being the only girl in X physics, girl where it shouldn't be in the top physics set, or going into some meetings in my earlier career where I was assumed that I was the assistant and actually possibly the manager in the room because of gender. At the time, I probably didn't think about, I'm here to be a pioneer. I probably felt a little bit uncomfortable, but I think in those moments you kind of got a choice. You've got a choice to kind of feel uncomfortable or brave, and kind of go, do you know what? I do deserve to be here, but actually what motivates me in anything that I've kind of tried to kind of pioneer in this space is not actually about me at all, because I found myself in this situation. What if I could give myself the task of making sure other people could follow me to that same destination, perhaps without any of the feelings of uncomfortableness or not belonging. So I think those are, in terms of, as you think about, lots of conversations about women in leadership and pioneering, I think it's about taking some of those uncomfortable moments that you may have experienced and kind of choose, what do you want to do with them, and how might you change it for people that follow you?
It seems like for you in particular, as I was getting to know your story a little bit, that curiosity side of you seems to be pretty strong. So I'm just wondering, that curiosity side of you, well, A, is my observation correct? You seem like a pretty curious person. And B, if it is, do you think that curiosity was a bit of fuel for you to, even in those uncomfortable moments, to say, yeah, but I want to figure this out too?
Yeah, no, I love being curious. I love kind of finding myself in situations I don't understand, or also actually kind of putting myself kind of in situations to learn. And I really believe that, you learn the most by putting yourself at what I call the front line of the business. Anybody who works with me, near me, will know that if I could choose between sitting in a meeting room with a PowerPoint, or visiting a field with farmers, or kind of going to the front line of our business, our pilot plants, I am 100x happier when I'm learning and being curious at the front line of the business, because I think you then get to see the reality of what's happening. I give you one example of being curious, and I know many of the listeners will have many of these themselves, but it was around about 8 years ago that I embarked on, and I made a commitment that I was going to really use curiosity. Now I was going to learn into the role, and I had the privilege of running many of our categories from a procurement and a sustainability point of view. And I set myself the challenge that I was going to learn about these categories from the best business leaders on this planet, the farmers. So I said, I'm going to try and visit 100 farmers in 100 fields in 20 different countries, and see what I see and learn. And as I say, that's probably defined the next decade of my career, many of the learnings that I had on that kind of curiosity gig.
It seems like there's a book right there. Just 100 farmers in 20 countries on the planet. So what did these great business people teach you?
Oh gosh, so many things. And I think, first of all, they taught me not to make assumptions. So I think, when you go and visit a farmer, be it in a kind of a mint farm, a cocoa farm, you probably go in with some assumptions. And I think the first thing is, what you've got to do is you've got to kind of really be truly present and listen. And that was the first thing that I learned. I think the second thing I learned and was just truly blown away with in so many of these experiences was that farmers are multi-gener, in a family, multi-generational business. So think not in quarters, not in years, but actually in generations. And so some of the most strategic thinking that I've ever witnessed is probably in some of the most humble farmers' hands. I remember sat, as I say, I can see this wonderful farmer who I met. And she was in Kenya, and she was talking about her farm, and we were stood there in a field, and she was talking about her expansion, and she could see the field that she owned, and then she introduced me to her daughter, and she said, by the time my daughter is managing this farm, it will have 3 more fields, because I will have had 2 more cows and I'll be able to do this. And she was so kind of thinking about long-term strategy. So the second thing I probably learned is, don't assume that strategy happens in a boardroom by super high-powered, business leaders. It's happening at the front line of our planet. So that was probably the second thing. But I could literally go on for the next 10 hours talking about that topic. So I'll
and I think we should record that sometime. I think that'd be an amazing podcast. So I guess part of the thing I'm thinking about as you're talking about this is, I talk to a lot of executives, both on the podcast and beyond the podcast at times, and there's so many of them that that want to get out and about a little bit more, but they find themselves kind of deeply invested in the presentations and the boardroom meetings and the PowerPoints and the Excel spreadsheets and all those type of things that are very taxing and time consuming, and kind of sometimes get in their way between themselves and some of the things they want to do. How do you kind of carve out your time or make room for this to happen?
So I talk there about some heavy time investment, kind of curiosity gigs, and learning. I think, I can think of yesterday, I had the opportunity to kind of, I call it get my boots dirty when I go and visit a farm. I had an opportunity yesterday to go and get my boots dirty by talking to one of our digital associates about a kind of a system and a tool, some analytics that I was really interested in. And it's about how you ask the question. So the question I could have said is, come and give me a PowerPoint and talk to me about contract lifecycle management, actually. That'll get everybody excited.
I might pass on that 10-hour podcast, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I could have said, come and give me a presentation and tell me about the opportunities and the pain points. But I didn't say that. I said, can I come and see and go into the system with you, and let's put a contract in there, and sit with me and let's go through this together. The learning I got in that 20-minute visit to the front line, I have used, I think, some of the evidence and the insights I got from that simple 20 minutes, I think 4 times in the last 24 hours, to help drive some significant change. And so I think, in terms of, don't let time be a barrier to being curious. Curate a different question to allow you to get the experience.
As you were going through that, as well as talking about going out and meeting with the farmers, one thing that came to my mind is, maybe it's just my own experience, but I think other people can relate to this as well. Whether you're the farmer or the person working on the tool you were just talking about, or you're the executive visiting, there's kind of a kind of a dog and pony show thing that kind of happens sometimes, right? That the person's coming to the farm person coming to the farm may have some expectations about how they'll be treated and how they'll interact, or maybe the person running the farm says, "Oh, here comes my most important customer," and how do you kind of dismantle some of that framework that gets in the way of having an actual conversation?
So, I think there's a few things that I try and do. So first of all, I demonstrate how I'm really interested in learning. So rather than if I'm being taken round a farm. And sometimes, you do see, or if you're taking around a supplier's factory, there's often a kind of a guided route. Mm-hmm. I tend to go off the guided route, and potentially even off the guided person who's been curated for me to talk to, and try and have some kind of sideline conversations, just so that I can demonstrate that I'm really interested in hearing from how it is. The second, and again, I am going to talk about contract lifecycle management. Again, you'll be pleased to hear. Yesterday, when I
bring it on.
Bring it on. Yesterday, when I was having this kind of 20-minute visit, again, the associate who was kind of doing this had curated a contract I might want to put in. And, you know, and the first one, why don't we choose this supplier to do it? And I went, no, can I choose? And they would kind of go, yeah, but I don't know. I said, it doesn't matter what comes up. It really doesn't matter. Just let me choose and we'll see what happens. And I could see that the associate was probably a bit nervous because they didn't know what was coming because it hadn't been planned. And so in kind of that choosing your own adventure, as it were, you've got to make sure that people feel really safe to show what's there. And I think that's another job of real learning, to kind of create that safety for people to say, it doesn't matter how many, and it was in, you know, how many suppliers of this name come up. And I know our vendor master data is not beautifully clean. I'm expecting to find something uncomfortable. It's okay. Let's go and find it together.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see that happening, right? Because they have this almost a script, right? That they've prepared. Okay, we're going to put an ABC company, and then ABC company is going to pop up, and there'll be no confusion. All the blanks will be filled in perfectly. And you're like, no, let's do XYZ, and then it shows up with 3 different versions of the same XYZ, and the fact that spirit of saying to them, you know, I know this isn't going to be perfect. None of our databases are perfect. We're constantly scrubbing and trying to make them better. And that's true for any institution of any size, right? Constantly cleaning their CRMs or whatever instruments they're using. I just love that idea because it's sometimes, if you don't do those type of things as a leader, you sometimes don't find out what's really happening at ground zero, right? You get this story that appears on one side of the curtain. And I guess a lot of it is what once you start to realize, okay, we're getting to the kernel of whatever the truth or reality is here a little bit, how you handle that is huge, right? Because if you all of a sudden freak out or get so upset or whatever it might be, then there's no way they're going to show the next executive that thing.
Yeah. And you know, it's the spirit of which you come into it. And you know, I've learned from probably experiences my own. You know, when you've had experiences, you know, in your career where where leaders have come to you and with that real curiosity, that real empathy and create that safety, you'll tell them as it is, and that creates the richest learning of environment, and also the environment which you and then I've got loads of experience of, by showing the reality where I've then got the help I really needed. And I think that's the other responsibility, that as you're learning, you know, and about what's really at the front line and really getting to those insights, you can then be a much more effective change agent to help enable those that you in terms of all the challenges, all the opportunities that you can amplify by seeing them, but kind of creating that trust, that safety to kind of see it as it is important. I don't think it's difficult to do, but you've got to be really cognizant that it's your responsibility, or you won't get the opportunity to learn that could be in front of you.
I remember my dad telling me this story. He's going to be 94 this summer, and he's still on top of his game. But he was in the U.S. Navy back in the 50s, and I remember him telling me that he's an enlisted seaman in the Navy and worked on a destroyer, I believe it was, as a ship, and they would be going into port somewhere, and they would know a couple of days in advance they're going to port. So they would start painting the ship to make it look better, which they were constantly painting the ship, but they would paint right over the rust or the problem areas or whatever it might be. And he said, as soon as we came into port, it looked so nice. And then we go right back out to sea and we'd be scraping that paint off that we just put on it to try to fix what was going on underneath it. And I think sometimes we have that type of thing in organizations where the people who are in the fields as the farmers who are running those businesses, or the person who's working in the database and working on the contract that you were talking about, you know, they see the rust, but they sometimes cover it up because they're not sure how well it'll be received, or they're trying to maintain a bit of a facade.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, the benefit, if you get to see the rust, is you can then help understand, you know, why did that happen? Where's it in terms of what's the cause of that, and how might we together solve that, rather than kind of smelling the paint. Although I have to confess, I do still tidy up and throw all my stuff into my closet when my mother comes and visits, so it looks a bit tidier than it is.
It seems reasonable. I do the same thing. I've got to keep it ship shape, as they say, from my father.
Exactly.
So I think that when I first read your job description, which kind of kept going because you've got a big job here, I thought, did the 11-year-old who was interested in how her hair stood on end in a physics class just take her curiosity to the nth degree? Because you have research and development, procurement, and sustainability. I mean, people who probably are familiar with your company, but how big of a role is that? Because that sounds massive.
Well, I never think about it in terms of what's the scale of the role, because it's kind of like, what's the possibility of connecting the most brilliant group of leaders who I have in my team, and actually this is a relatively, it's an innovation in terms of an operating model, putting those three functions that are often kind of separate, or perhaps you could often see sometimes see procurement and sustainability together, but this is relatively unique and kind of experimental. I've been doing this for a year now, and as I say, yeah, the scope is broad, but the opportunity to make the connections is just immense in terms of thinking about, as we're designing, the tastiest products that our consumers love, making sure that we're doing that and thinking about the planet, the greenhouse footprint of the materials we're using, how we're sourcing it, and kind of putting, the resilience of the raw materials that we're using, holding the tension for getting all of that right together is something that is a real unlocker, and kind of creating that tension is a curious moment. How might we solve for all of those things together and innovate into some of those opportunities?
I love the way you frame that, because as I was setting it up, I was like, oh my goodness, look at this. You have these three massive roles, and how do you keep your arms all around it? And you were like, I just think about the possibilities. Like, what can we do here? How did the role come about? Did you play a role in kind of shaping these three pieces coming together? Did somebody approach you and say, hey, would you take this over? How did you end up sitting in that role?
So I think, as always, operating model should follow strategy, and if we kind of layer that back a bit in terms of, with Mars Snacking, the business unit I'm in, really sustainability is, and the consumer and delicious products, sustainability is the heart of what we do. And so my previous role was in terms of sustainability and procurement, so those were already connected. And we were kind of looking at, how might we make even more progress, driving the impact that we want to have with the consumers, driving the impact that we want to have in terms of our sustainability, and unlock the potential of our partners and our suppliers. And when you kind of put that kind of possibility, or create that possibility statement at a strategic level, then you kind of go, well, why wouldn't we put these three functions together and see if that can help us advance and accelerate our strategy?
So let's say, for example, I was listening to the podcast, and perhaps I'm thinking about a strategic move we're looking to make, and maybe changing our model in the process of doing that. But then I'm sitting there going, yeah, but even if I'm not thrilled with the outcomes we have at this moment, at least I know what I've got. And if I change it, there's a risk associated with it. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. Like, you all made the decision to change it. There's risk associated with changing it. But what's been the upside? If I were to say to you, Amanda, like, what's an example of bringing these three things together that has been just a great outcome for the business?
So maybe, I'll answer the question, but I think, first of all, in terms of maybe talking about risk, I always kind of think about this in terms of, is this a one-way door? It could never be unwound, or is this a two-way door? And there's very few decisions that you ever make and there are some, but that can't be iterated or evolved. So I think whenever I do anything, it's kind of, and I use the word, let's experiment in, let's learn into this, because again, it doesn't make it feel quite so. You don't have to be right. You just have to be brave to experiment and try. So I think there's the mindset of which you go into something. You can de-risk it for yourself by holding it as an experiment or a learning in versus I've got to show that I'm right. Because if you hold yourself accountable to be right, you get yourself into this prove mode. Whereas if you hold yourself to account to experiment and learn, you can just keep on being kind of curious. So first of all is the mindset. But in terms of a specific example, I'll use one from a couple of weeks ago where we were talking. Actually, we had one of our partners in, and we've been working on a raw material that has significant impacts in terms of its greenhouse gas. It's really hard to source, so resilience is a challenge, and it's relatively expensive. So you kind of put those three things together, and in previous iterations of my role, I may have felt more responsible for solving one or the other of those kind of tensions. And maybe that will have led to kind of a trade-off conversation. With the responsibility that my kind of leadership team have across all those three domains of sustainability, resilience, the taste of the product, what you then get is an opportunity to innovate and solve for all. And the conversation I was kind of referring to a couple of weeks ago was with one of our valuable partners, and we were having a dinner, and we were kind of celebrating the fact that who would have thought we took this challenge and we've actually solved for all of those three tensions together and got something so much better out of it. So just a small example.
No, that's a great example. It reminds me a bit of, our founder, Stephen Covey, talked about third alternatives. And oftentimes we think, I want my position, you want your position. He would suggest there might be a third alternative. In your situation here, because there are these different tensions, I would imagine if you don't have stewardship over the three areas, it becomes very easy to say, well, I'm going to solve for this because this is what I mostly care about. But when you and then if the other party who happens to run this other part of the business doesn't like it, we can talk to our boss about it, type of thing. Let that boss resolve it, as opposed to you going, okay, I've got to figure this out. And as you said earlier, but I can think about what are the possibilities. Like, who could figure this out? How can we figure it out? If we figure this out, what's possible? I just love that context about what's the possibilities. And I really enjoyed that discussion about experimentation, the idea that I'm not jumping off a cliff here. I can turn around, I can change, I can pivot, I can learn from that. So there's people listening to the podcast who maybe they're in the C-suite right now and they're benefiting from hearing Amanda's advice about how she handles particular things or from her story and her own curiosity. But there's other people earlier on in their journey that might think they want to do that, go into the C-suite, or would just like to make the next good move or smart move in their career. So in the spirit of kind of learning in and experimenting, what would you suggest that regardless of where somebody is in that career journey of theirs, what is something you've learned that's been a pretty good thing that everybody should consider embracing?
So the one thing that comes to mind, and I'm not saying I learned this quickly. It probably, if there's I probably wish I'd kind of learned this earlier on in my career, is that balance between understanding your strengths, your innate talents, and understanding kind of where you might need to push yourself to develop. I think if there's one thing I would encourage everybody to do is to kind of do a strength check for themselves. And how do you find a strength? It's something that if somebody asks you to do, it kind of gives you energy. It feels light. It feels exciting. How do you know if it's something you need to develop? It probably feels a bit heavier and harder. And it doesn't mean to say you won't try equally at it. Find your strengths and make sure you hold, how do I turn my strengths into superpowers so I work as hard at the things I'm good at and make those even better than getting a bit obsessed with, and these are the things I need to kind of go from kind of mediocre to good because everybody around me is good at them and I'm not. Look at the things you're brilliant at and push yourself even harder. If there was only one thing I wish I'd learned a decade earlier, that was it.
Well, thank you for that insight, and I agree so much. It's funny you said if it's something you're strong at, it feels light and not much of a burden. And you are strong at conversing and sharing ideas, because this whole conversation to me has felt light and easy and just so enjoyable. I appreciate your time, and I know the listeners do as well. So, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us for a C-suite conversation. I wish you all the best.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Well, folks, that's all I have for today's episode. Big thanks to Amanda Davies for joining me to share her insights from the farmer's field to the boardroom. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for joining me. My name's Dr. Patrick Ledden. Now go make it a great day.